we just covered the statute of frauds. And the statute of frauds, again, requires that certain contracts be in writing. Now we're going to talk about a few exceptions to the writing requirement. And this is confusing, isn't it? Because generally, oral contracts, contracts you're just talking through, that you make a contract through a conversation with someone, generally they're enforceable. An exception to that rule is that certain contracts must be in writing. And then this is an exception to the exception. Okay? So there are certain times when contracts that fall within the statute of frauds are enforced by a court. Okay. These are some of those times. When a buyer of land has made valuable improvements in it, or the buyer is in possession of it and has paid part of the purchase price, even an oral contract to sell is enforceable. So if you agree to buy my house and I agree to sell it to you, and then say you move in and you paid me a $10,000 down payment, then a court would enforce that. Even though that fell within the statute of frauds, the court would enforce that. Or say I agreed to sell you an acre of land, and then you started building your house on it. Well, that's an improvement, and that's also an exception to the statute of frauds. So a court would still enforce it in that case. Under the UCC, contracts involving specially manufactured goods and contracts for which payment has been made and accepted are enforceable. Okay, there's actually two different exceptions in that bullet, so let me parse them out. The first one is contracts involving specially marked manufactured goods. So let's say I call someone over the phone and I say, hey, I want you to make a statue. I want you to create a statue or something of me. I want it to look like me, look like my family, or look like my family dog or something like that. And it's going to cost, $5,000. And the person agrees over the phone to do that. And they do it. It takes them a few months, they make this statue, and they say, okay, it's time for you to pay me for it. And you're like, you know what, I changed my mind. Well, who else can that person sell a statue of you to? It was specially manufactured. It had specifications that only you would want. So those are some of the times when a court will still enforce a contract for a sale of goods, even over $500, even if it was done orally, if it was specially manufactured. Another exception under the UCC is a contract for which payment has been made and accepted. And so this is an example of, you go to Best Buy, you get your laptop, and you go to the counter, and you give them the money, or you swipe your card and they get the money. So in other words, you have accepted their offer and you paid for it, then the deal is done. So that is also an exception. The contracts for which payment has been made, so it's been paid for and accepted. So you've paid and then the contract has been accepted. Okay, they accepted your payment, you paid for it, and you have possession of it. So that's an exception. They can't later on come back and say, hey, we want the computer back, or you can't go back later unless under their refund policy and give it back, because that is not an exception. It's an exception to the exception. Okay, it's an exception to the statute of frauds, even things that are $500 or more, goods over $500 or more. Another exception to the statute of frauds occurs when a defendant admits in court, or in documents filed in court that an oral contract exists. So even if let's say I agree to sell you a table saw for $750 or something. Then let's say I'm a retailer, you're a customer, just to make it kind of one of those transactions under the UCC, and I say, hey, I will sell you this table saw for $750, and I'll hold it for you. You know, I'll give you until Friday or something. So you come back on Thursday, here's my $750, and the retailer says, you know what, I changed my mind. You know, but you know, you agreed to it. I mean, you said, yes, I agreed to it, and they agreed to it, and you came back with the money, and they changed their mind. But what if you sued the retailer, and in a deposition or on the stand, the retailer said, yep, there was a contract? Well, then that's another exception to the statute of frauds. If you admit that there's a contract, then that's an exception to the statute of frauds. Because the statute of frauds, it's designed so that someone won't take advantage of someone else. You know, based on, well, he said he would sell me that property, and the other person said, I didn't say that. It's to stop things like that from happening. It's to help, you know, stop confusion, and especially when you're dealing with big items that affect maybe not just you, but your neighbors when you're talking about land, and affects a lot of other people. So there's certain categories in the statute of frauds that it's meant to protect. Now we're going to go to the section on beneficiaries. Unless otherwise stated in the contract, most contract rights can be assigned. And we're going to talk about assignment of contracts in a minute, but let's focus on beneficiaries. One or more of the original parties to a contract may intend for their agreements to benefit a third party. Such parties are called third-party beneficiaries. Intended beneficiaries, can sue for enforcement of the contract. So even though you may not have been a person, a party to the contract, you might not have been the offeror or the offeree, you're a third party, you can still sue if you're an intended beneficiary. These include donee, D-O-N-E-E, donee beneficiaries, and creditor beneficiaries. A donee beneficiary, an example of this is grandma enters into a contract with someone named Oldfield to purchase a Jaguar to be given to the grandchild. So you're the grandchild, okay? So your grandma enters into a contract with Oldfield to buy a Jaguar, and it's going to be your graduation present, all right? So Oldfield's supposed to give the car to you. Well, if Oldfield, you know, he takes the down payment from grandma, but then he refuses to go through the contract, the sale of the Jaguar, then you can sue because you were the intended beneficiary. You could sue Oldfield, okay, but you can't sue your grandma if you're a donee beneficiary. But you can sue Oldfield, the person that should have turned over the car. There are also creditor beneficiaries. Let's say that Alice, Bill, and Cody, there's three people there, and let's say that Alice owes Bill $1,000. Okay, Alice owes Bill $1,000. And then let's say that Alice and Cody, and actually let me just do this, make it a little bit easier. So Alice owes Bill. Okay. Now, let's say that Alice and Cody enter into an agreement. Okay. And Alice is going to perform some work for C. All right, Alice is going to paint C's house for $1,000. But the contract, the actual contract says, I want you to pay B. So A owes B the money, and so A says instead of paying me, pay Bill the money. All right. So B is a creditor beneficiary. And B, if B doesn't get paid, B can sue A and B can sue C. So B could sue everyone involved as a creditor beneficiary. Incidental beneficiaries include third parties who unintentionally benefit from a contract. Incidental beneficiaries can't sue. The book gave the example of, let's say that you own a nice house and you contract for security service for your house, and maybe your neighbor gets kind of a benefit from that, right? Because maybe their house is right next door, and the security guy is out by the front, out by the street, and is basically kind of watching out for the whole neighborhood. Well, let's say the security guy takes a break when he's not supposed to take a break, and the neighbor's house gets vandalized. They can't sue the security guard because they're just an incidental. They're just an incidental beneficiary. They weren't really an intended beneficiary. You might have contracted for the security guard to look over your house, but you didn't contract for that security guard to look over your neighbor's house. It just happened to occur that it was also helpful for them. But in that case, they would just be an incidental beneficiary, so they can't sue. Assignment of contracts. Assignment of contracts. The party to the original contract that assigns his or her rights to another is called the assignor. ASSIGNOR. And I'm going to make an example of this. Put a diagram up here. And this diagram is going to be from page 259 of your textbook. Okay. So, we have Radioland Retail. I'm just going to say radio. Radioland Retail contracts to buy radios from Electronics Inc. Okay, so Radioland agrees to buy radios from Electronics and becomes obligated to pay $5,000. So Radio owes Electronics $5,000. That's the original contract, okay? But like I said earlier, unless the contract says otherwise, most contracts can be assigned. Okay, so Electronics is owed $5,000 from Radio. So Electronics can assign their payment, the payment that is owed to them, to someone else. Okay? And that's what they do. They assign the payment to a manufacturer's credit. And I'm just going to call this credit. Okay? In this arrangement, Radioland Retail is, and I'm going to talk about these words a little bit more. Radio is the obligor. Okay. And Electronics is the obligee. Okay, so the obligor, Radio owes $5,000 to Electronics. Okay, they're the obligor, obligee. The money is owed to Electronics. But Electronics assigns their right to the money to manufacturer's credit. So they are also, in this scenario, Electronics is called the assignor. Okay, and then manufacturer's credit is the assignee. Okay, because Electronics Inc. has assigned their right to the $5,000 from Radioland Retail. They've assigned the right to that money to a manufacturer's credit. So now, manufacturer's credit has the right to collect the $5,000 from Radioland. Does that make sense? So now, instead of electronics having the right to collect the money from radio, now manufacturer's credit has the right to collect the money, because manufacturer's credit is the assignee. They've been assigned the right to collect the $5,000, and so they can get it from radio. And we'll go through a few of the terms, make sure you understand them. Okay, so the party to the original contract that assigns his or her right to another is called the assignor. Okay, because electronics and radio, they were parties to the original contract, and electronics was owed $5,000. So they were the assignor. The third party to whom the rights are assigned is the assignee. So now credit is the assignee, and they have the right to the $5,000 that was originally owed to electronics. The other party to the original contract is known as the obligor. That's radio, obligor. The easiest way to think about this is to imagine a contract in which one party performs services in exchange for money from another party. Okay, so maybe electronics, instead of selling something, maybe electronics was hired to perform a service for radio. And so radio owes money to electronics for the service. It can be service or products, doesn't matter. But now they owe money. The party performing the services can assign his or her rights to the money to a third party. Okay, like this. When an assignment is made, an assignee should notify the obligor immediately. Immediately. So as soon as this assignment is made, as soon as electronics assigns their right to the $5,000 to credit, credit needs to notify radio, who is the obligor, immediately. Because if radio doesn't know about the assignment, and they pay the $5,000 to electronics, who then maybe doesn't give it to credit, credit can't sue radio. Because radio didn't know about credit. Okay? That's why if you are ever an assignee, you need to notify the obligor immediately. Because that's the only way that radio is going to be on the hook if they fail to give you the money, instead of maybe the original obligee. Okay? An assignee cannot sue an obligor who pays the money to the assignor if they have no notice of the assignment. An assignment that substantially increases the burden of performance to the obligor cannot be assigned. So let's say that the contract is for you to, let's say you live in Dallas, and the contract is for you to sing. You're a great opera singer, and you're going to sing opera in Dallas. And you've been paid. You've been paid $10,000 for one night of singing. You're really good. And what if that opera house wants to assign your singing to an opera house in Alaska? Okay, that would substantially increase the burden on you. And an assignment that substantially increases the burden of performance to the obligor cannot be assigned. Okay? So when it's just money, someone owes, if you're electronics and you're like, someone owes me the money, I can assign that to credit, But if it's something else that it substantially increases the burden on the obligor, it's not really hard for the obligor. They just put a different address on the check, right, on the envelope. Instead of putting electronics on the check, they just put credit on the check and send it to a different address. That's not a substantial burden. But if it was, then that could not be assigned. And there's also a lot of contracts that have no assignment clauses. For instance, there's some like landlord-tenant contracts that say maybe you can't assign this lease to someone else without my consent. Novation. And I'm going to give you an example of when sometimes it is with consent of everyone involved in a landlord-tenant agreement in just a second. Novation, that's the last subject in Chapter 8 that we're going to cover. A novation is a 3 or more party contract wherein the original contracting parties agree to relieve the obligor from liability by substituting an assignee in the place of this party. Okay, you need an example to understand that. So let's say that you are the original, obligor, and hang on. Let me do a different example. Okay, let's say that a friend takes your place in a lease. All right? If the landlord consents to the substitution, then you're off the hook even if your friend doesn't pay his rent. Okay? So if the landlord consents, then you have 3 people involved. And one of the original parties, let's see, it was your landlord and you were the original parties to the lease. Well, if you have this third person over here, and the landlord is good with it, you're good with it, and the other person is good with it, you can replace your place in the original contract with this other person. So now you're off the hook if everyone is involved and if everyone agreed to it. So in that case, the landlord agreed to it, you agreed to it, and your friend. So it's a novation. So instead of you having to pay rent, it's now your friend having to pay rent. And if your friend stops paying rent, if it was an actual novation, then the landlord can't go after you because the landlord agreed that your friend could take your place in the contract. So that's novation. If you have any questions from the lecture, feel free to email me. And if I'm getting several of the same types of questions, I'll put something under announcements or I'll make sure to cover it next Tuesday in class. So until then, have a great week.